Welcome to the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. In this series, we'll bring you 12 of the best talks from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. This episode is called The Missing Links, explaining the absence of debate on transnational organised crime in India.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. We are honoured to have you with us. My name is Prem Mahadevan, and I will be moderating this session. Today, we examine the question of why there is so little debate about transnational organized crime in India. The country is projected to become the world's most populous in 2023. It is already the world's fifth largest economy. It has the second largest diaspora after China. Yet, if one looks at the academic literature on transnational organized crime, one sees a heavy focus on Eastern Europe and particularly the post-Soviet space. According to a very prominent writer in the field of transnational organized crime, writing in 2008, a general belief and observation is that, I quote him, "The collapse of the Soviet Union is the single most important cause of the exponential growth in organized crime that we have seen around the world in the last 2 decades." End quote. Much of the narrative around TOC since the 1990s has focused on the collapse of the Soviet Union and of former Yugoslavia. Yet, India and China, two states that also transitioned out of socialism and to a new economic model, are hardly ever discussed. Is this because they did not experience a political collapse, or is this because of intellectual laziness on the part of scholars and researchers? Is it that Cold War era criminologists focused so heavily on Eastern Europe that they overlooked Asia? We will be discussing this question during the course of our roundtable panel today. From my side, I have spent the last year researching on Chinese criminal networks. From academic sources, it is evident that China too faced similar problems as did Russia with adjusting from the transition from communism and socialism to capitalism, or rather state-led capitalism. The problems were not on the same scale though. The world was not looking closely enough at China to notice. Perhaps there was no regional or country expertise. But what we do see is that the reforms that followed Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour actually led to an increase in elite corruption and in violent street-level criminality in China. The same applies to India. India liberalized its economy in 1991. What followed was a growing frequency of political scams and violent crime. But this was overlooked by experts. Part of the problem was due to a lack of data. That in itself is a weak excuse, however. India has a relatively free and open society. China, on the other hand, has a totalitarian state structure with an all-encompassing system of censorship. In both countries, local gangs operate with political patronage and police protection. Yet, India seems almost as difficult as China to conduct research on organized crime in. Why is that? To brainstorm this question, we have an exceptionally high-powered roundtable of experts. I'm pleased to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Ajay Sahni. Dr. Sahni is Executive Director of the Institute of Conflict Management in New Delhi. His path-breaking research has led to policy changes within India, most notably efforts to improve the police-to-population ratio. Dr. Sahni has developed a unique database of terrorism-related statistics that has for 2 decades been the standard reference point for research on South Asian militancy. As a veteran of the policy research community, he is uniquely placed to explain why there is no comparable body of research on organized crime in India. Our second speaker will be Mr. Sandeep Unnithan. Mr. Unnithan is editor of News 9+, a leading Indian broadcaster. Over a highly illustrious career, he has reported on such topics as the Mumbai Mafia, counterterrorism, and maritime security. He is the author of Black Tornado, a riveting account of the 26/11 terrorist attack on Mumbai. Mr. Unnithan hails from Mumbai and as such has deep insight into the social dynamics of the city and its links with maritime smuggling. He has closely observed the rise and fall of factional violence within the city's underworld. Our third speaker will be Professor Natalia Galisheva. Professor Galisheva is head of the World Economy Department at MGIMO University in Moscow. She served for 4 years with the Russian Consulate General in Mumbai during the late 1990s. Professor Galisheva has extraordinary insights into how the Indian economy developed following partial reforms in 1991. She is uniquely qualified to help us understand to what extent macroeconomic factors affected societal stability and how well India handled its economic transition. Our fourth speaker will be Dr. Milan Vaishnav. Dr. Vaishnav is director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is the author of the book, When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics. The book examines in detail the criminalization of politics in the world's largest democracy. Dr. Vaishnav has studied the local processes by which voters make electoral choices and how these choices impact governance quality. He is uniquely placed to help us understand the dynamics of political mafias. Our last speaker will be Dr. Wanda Felber-Brown. Dr. Felber-Brown is director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors at the Brookings Institution. She is the world's foremost expert on illicit markets. Her experience in fieldwork encompasses roughly 24 countries. Among these is India, where Dr. Felber-Brown has conducted research on wildlife trafficking and on water mafias. She can help us see patterns of similarity and difference based on her own observations of organized crime in different parts of the world. To all our distinguished speakers, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime warmly expresses its gratitude for sharing your knowledge with us. To quickly go about explaining the order of business, we will proceed through an opening round of questions with one question directed to each speaker by myself. Each speaker will be addressed in turn, and then once the questions have been answered, the speakers will be invited in their turn, in the reverse order in which they spoke, to ask questions of each other. Around 50 minutes into the session, my colleagues and I in the conference secretariat will go through the audience questions and pose some of them to the speakers. I would like to begin with an opening question for Dr. Ajay Sani. Dr. Sani, when an Indian person thinks of organized crime, the name of Dawood Ibrahim and his D company is perhaps the first that comes to mind. For those who are unaware, Dawood Ibrahim is an Indian origin gangster who has been designated as a global terrorist by the US government. Ibrahim is believed to live in Pakistan, a claim the Pakistani government routinely denies. My question to Dr. Sani is why, given the threat of a crime terror nexus and the implications of overseas-based gangsters being used to carry out subversive activities, has there been so little effort to comprehensively map out international criminal networks in India? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, now, Prem, as far as Dawood Ibrahim is concerned, his position is certainly unique. It's not as if organized crime in India starts with Dawood Ibrahim. If you even take the Bombay crime networks, he was preceded by a very, very organized setup headed by Haji Mastan. And with the more important names were people like Vardarajan Bodadier and some other associates of his. Now, they dominated the organized crime setup for years. And it was only after Dawood comes in that there was a sudden change in the very texture of organized crime in Mumbai, in India. He brought in a very, very much more violent kind of pattern of criminality. It's not as if the others were not violent, but he was far more violent. He brought in drugs. Now, the earlier groups had never gone in. Karim Lalla, Haji Bastan, Badaliya had never gone in for drug smuggling. So that was a major shift. But most importantly, you must recognize that all these groups prior to Dawood were essentially organized criminal groups which worked collusively with the state. They never confronted the state. Dawood Ibrahim, in 1993, orchestrated what is till date the worst terrorist attack in India, a series of bombings in Mumbai, in which 257 people were killed, more almost 600 or 700 people were injured. So you had a complete shift in terms of a generational shift in the enormity of what was done. Then he goes across into Pakistan and begins to run not just a criminal network from there, but also to run a arrangement with the inter-services intelligence of facilitating terrorist movement, the movement of weaponry, facilitation of terrorist operations in India, but also across other theaters, wherever he was tasked. So this is a man who is not only an organized crime actor, he's also a terrorist designated both by India and the United States, a 25 million reward on his head, and nobody can find him, which is a rather surprising since everybody seems to know where he lives. And he survived for 50 years in crime. He established himself in the 70s and he's still around. So I think that gives him the very unique position that he is in. Now, why have we not spent more time and effort and resource on researching organized crime, since it has such an impact, and now it has an increasing overlay with terrorist organizations, not just in Mumbai, not just with the Dawood gang, but multiple. In Punjab, you have the Khalistanis overlapping with the drug smuggling, which is a very, very major operation. So why doesn't it get researched? Multiple reasons. I will quickly go through them since our time is limited. First of all, you must understand there is a great deal of information available, but it is completely dispersed. The information is more reflected in popular culture than in research or even in reportage. Why is this? First, there is no consolidated data available. You mentioned data as an issue. Data is a very important issue. And it's very difficult to get to this data for a simple reason that it is not an IPC, Indian Penal Code crime. That is, it is not a central crime. Organized crime, there is no law to deal with organized crime at the center. So there is no centralized database. You have a crime in India which doesn't really look at organized crime because there's no IPC section. The states, some of the states have got, many states now have got local laws. The Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, the UP Control of Gujarat Control of Organized Crime Act, all of them similar and overlapping. But these databases are completely, or whatever, these records, I won't even call them databases because they are not consolidated. There is no research going on. So you again have some information which would be researchable, but it is dispersed to the states. There is no access. Even if you seek access, the cost of access would be enormous because, as I said, this is dispersed information. This is in thanas, in police stations where FIRs are recorded, or if it is sent into the new centralized database, it is there as individual crimes, murder, theft, intimidation, whatever. Now, for instance, if you take crime in India, which is the consolidated report from the center, they record that in 2021, and this is the only datum given for organized crime, that the Maharashtra Control of Crimes Act, Organized Crime Act, had 60 cases registered in 2021. This is absurd. I mean, it is completely nonsensical. But then you come back to the same thing. Operatives of organized criminal gangs would be documented for individual crimes under all sorts of other sections of criminality. You again do not even have at the state level a consolidation under the Maharashtra Organized Crime Act. So then you have the next stage of difficulty, the problem of methodology. There is no given methodology. There are no systems within government for research. You need research which is embedded within the enforcement structure. Now, an enforcement structure is unlikely to be spending very much time to do research. Then you have to understand that this, I think, is the most important. deterrent to setting up institutions and encouraging and resourcing research. This is the fact that organized crime is a collusive crime. It involves the state and its actors. When we go back to 1993, you may recall there was this report by the then Home Secretary, the Union Home Secretary, N.N. Vora, and he said that there is a criminal, bureaucratic, politician nexus. And unless this is addressed, we are not going to be able to resolve the problem of organized crime. The same applies to resolving the problem of researching organized crime. Now, I'm sure this is going to come up later with other speakers, but you must understand the degree of criminalization of Indian politics. 42% of the Union Council of Ministers current has criminal cases against them. 24 of these 78, that is 31% of ministers, were charged with what is called serious crime. Similarly, 43% of members of the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, have criminal charges pending against them, 29% for serious crime. The situation in the legislative assemblies is similar. So who is going to press for research on a subject which would implicate those who make the laws and those who apply the laws? And when we come to the Western literature on the subject, I'll just make a very quick concluding remark on that. They haven't focused on India, partly because of the problem of information, and also because organized crime in India has international linkages for organized crime in India have largely been inward flowing. Or as in the case of drugs today, where you have India as a major transit point, they are not the critical operatives. They are only a transit. Then the transits are multiple. Sri Lanka is also transit. Thailand is also a transit. Maldives is also transit. So you have many transit points. The source is the AFPAC region. So that's where, if any literature is available in the West, it's focusing on these countries. Finally, I'd just say there has been a proliferation of think tanks in India in the recent decades, but these are mostly advocacy groups who are promoting certain political and ideological positions or corporate interests. There is not much funding going around for a focused research on organized crime. I overshot myself, but I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. That was extremely helpful. And I think actually we're all going to overshoot. We know that. But if that keeps the conversation flowing, if that keeps us sharing ideas and information, that's perfectly fine. It's part of the game. And I think your point actually about the information being dispersed is important. I remember when I was researching on terrorism in the Indian Punjab, police intelligence on drug smugglers, on counter-terrorism, and on counterintelligence. The police files had to be brought together, fused together in an all-source fusion center, so that people could actually start looking at patterns by which drug smugglers were involved in supporting terrorism and were being supported by foreign countries, essentially. I would like to ask the next question to Mr. Sandeep Unnithan, and actually Dr. Sani has also already referred to this point about popular culture. Mr. Unnithan, a lot of the popular imagery that surrounds Indian organized crime focuses on the Mumbai Mafia, of which the D Company, Dawood Ibrahim's gang, is a part. And the imagery particularly comes from the city's film industry. Serious investigative journalism, however, seems to be scarce. What are the reasons for this? Is it that journalists are hesitant to explore questions about police and political collusion with the underworld? Or is there a lack of editorial support for such stories? Or is there a lack of data because there are, after all, national security implications to the question of transnational organized crime? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prem. I'd like to say that it's a combination of all the factors that you mentioned. Because, until a couple of years ago, there was a lot of active investigations into the criminal politician networks. Stars that were involved with the underworld were routinely called out. They were named and shamed, and there were a lot of, press coverage given to them. But of late, in the last couple of years, one sees that this kind of reportage has kind of literally dried up. And as you mentioned, one of the reasons is that a lot of media houses tend to discourage this kind of reportage, investigative journalism, especially when it concerns the crime, politician, and police nexus, that has kind of dried up. And I was talking to a friend of mine in Mumbai, one of the top investigative journalists there, and he was telling me about how he had this really big expose on a very prominent a politician of Mumbai and his, a criminal nexus that he had. And, they were in league with a builder and they were creating this huge scam. And his paper had promised to publish that on the front page. But the very day that this was to actually, be published, his paper had gone ahead and, signed a commercial deal with that particular builder. And so there was no question of carrying that story. And this, we've been seeing a pattern of this happening in the last couple of years as celebrities become more important to media houses and news organizations and TV channels. The kind of adverse reportage that an investigative journalist story would entail is somewhat inconvenient, and that's the reason that they're buried. And let's not forget that the case of J-Day, a very prominent investigative journalist in 2011, was bumped off by the underworld, by Chota Rajan's gangsters, just when he was prepared to write a story on something very sensational that this particular gang was involved in. And one really doesn't know the entire truth of that. That hasn't really been investigated to its logical outcome. So there have been a series of such incidents. And the Mumbai underworld, as Dr. Sani mentioned, I mean, that itself is, it's evolved from that very basic thing of small gangsters, the Karim Lalas, the Varadaraja Muddaliyas, and Yusuf Patels, and it's gone up to Dawood Ibrahim. And Dawood Ibrahim's rise in the early 80s, marked the kind of corporatization of the underworld, of the Mumbai underworld, and it still remains to a force in being. It's not as in your face as it used to be about 2 decades ago, when they had shootouts and extortion threats, where prominent builders and film personalities were at the receiving end. But it continues to be, out there. It's not in your face anymore. It's truly underground. But that also kind of, to answer what you said, that they have their links with the film industry, they have links with builders, but none of that is being investigated, primarily because they've kind of not been doing the kind of sensational shootouts, the extortion threats of the last 20 years. The underworld has kind of gone quiet, especially since the early 2000s. There have not been any major shootouts as such. The police encounters, these sticky encounters, typically what used to be called for, a lot of people say that these were actually extrajudicial killings, but those have gone down as well. And the underworld has kind of receded in the background. They're there. They still control all the networks. They still run the drugs. They still do the gold smuggling, but they all pretty much receded into the background. But the question, of course, is that it's not so much, it's an inconvenient truth, actually. The investigating of these links that they have with the politicians and the bureaucrats and the police. As Dr. Sani mentioned, this fact that the NN Vora committee report that was brought out in 1993 has still not been revealed to the public after nearly 3 decades. And it's just about some fragments of it have been released, but the entire report has not been revealed to the public. It's one of the most baffling, occurrences of the last few years, that a report as sensitive as that has still not been released to the Indian public. And one only can imagine the kind of data and revelations that report might have had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nathan. Actually, we're going to be coming back to this, but you talked about the crime politics nexus. You talked about the fact that there's a lack of investigative interest actually in investigation. I think all that is extremely relevant, because eventually the media is supposed to basically Journalism, I think, is writing the first draft of history. I think there's a quote like that. And we all, researchers, even if we do field work, we do fundamentally rely on the media to guide us and orient us. And if there is no media reportage, then we're operating essentially in terra incognita. My next question is for Professor Natalia Galisheva. Professor Galisheva, both the Russian Federation and India were forced by circumstances to adopt economic policies that transformed their societies. We in India look to Russia, previously the Soviet Union, as an elder brother, as a role model society that would guide us and help us develop. And we were also adversely affected, very much so, by the events of 1991. Now, there has been much commentary since then about how during the 1990s, criminal networks emerged in major Russian cities as a result of the privatization of industries and disruption in the labor market. Russia has dramatically changed since then, as has India. Going by your own observations of living in Mumbai during that time, would it be correct to say that the economic reforms of 1991 triggered a rise of mafia-like societies in India, or that it created disruptions in Indian society? Professor Galisheva.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you are quite right that both India and the US, the Russian Federation started liberal reforms in 1991, exactly Russia in 1992. But we can't say that these liberal reforms are the same because the former USSR and India were countries of different economic social models. That's why the sense of liberal economic reforms are different. The former USSR was a socialist state that is at the command of the administrative economy, and India was a capitalist state that is at the model of the state capitalism. Yes, the first resolution, industrial resolution, stated that India, that was adopted, by the way, in 1948, that India will be the society of socialist pattern. But the model of Indian economy was the state capitalism. That's why, once again, the sense of liberal economic reforms in India and in Russia are different. Specific features of liberal reforms in India and Russia are the following. You've already mentioned that there was the process of privatization in Russia. And if can we say it about India? No. Even the word privatization is not used in Indian economic literature. Usually economists and analytics use the word disinvestment. That's why, as it wasn't the process of privatization in India, the results of economic reforms are not as bad as they are in Russia. They were in Russia. Besides, if we compare the role of state, the role of public sector in Russia and in India within 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century, once again, the same, the role of state are different. The role of state, the role of public sector was drastically decreased in Russia in 1990s. And can we see it in India? Of course, once again, no. So that's why, in my opinion, we can't say that liberal reforms significantly badly influenced on the situation with organized crime in India. Liberal economic reforms didn't significantly affect social stability in India. Thanks to the process of disinvestment, it was quite reasonable. And in my opinion, it is much more reasonable than the process of privatization in Russia. So that's why these reforms didn't seriously add, but at the same time, frankly speaking, didn't subtract from society social stability in India and public security against organized crime. Even the share of unobserved, or now we use the word shadow, previously shadow economy, now we use the word unobserved economy. If we compare the share share of unobserved economy in India 1991, and nowadays it is slightly decreased. In 1991, the share of unobserved economy was approximately 23% of GDP. Nowadays, it is just approximately 18%. As our speakers have already mentioned, yes, the situation is rather difficult with organized crime in India. But in my opinion, what is responsible for? Yes, the pharmaceutical industry that has been developing rather quickly nowadays in in India, it can add some slight influence on organized crime. Besides diamond processing industry, it is also has been developing very quickly since the beginning of liberal reforms. That's why, but at the same time, if we are talking about the major economic challenges that Indian policymakers have failed to overcome over the last 30 years, the period of economic reforms that can some add to worse the situation with organized crime. That is, of course, social sector problems, poverty and hunger, or better say, undernourishment. Then low income and salaries which are significantly contribution to poverty. The inefficient pension system. Then illiteracy rate that is rather high in India nowadays. That is approximately 28%. So everything, these specific features of social sector can influence rather badly on organized crime situation in India. Then besides, of course, economic problems such as regional disparities in India, then a lack, or we can say shortage of capital resources for business. In this case, yes, some liberal reforms in some aspects can be considered as a slight trigger. But once again, if we compare Indian situation and Russian situation, of course, in Russia, the situation with organized crime was much worse than in India with the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Galesheva. It was deeply educative to listen to, and to be honest, actually, it was a little reassuring that we did not do so badly during the 1990s. If we look at now how Russia has dominated and overcome its problem of organized crime, it is actually in some ways an inspirational story, given how bad things were in the 1990s. While we return to looking at the particularities of India, my next question is for Dr. Milan Vaishnav. Dr. Vaishnav, the criminalization of politics has been touched upon already during the course of this panel. Now, it's a topic that has been written about in India for several decades. There has been growing public anger over political corruption, yet despite general awareness about political patronage of mafias, as well as well-reported scam investigations in the 1990s and the 2000s, there seems to have been no effort towards dismantling the politics crime nexus. In your opinion, does such inaction come down to inherent Indian fatalism, a kind of a complementarity between awareness and indifference on the part of Indian voters? And if so, if you would agree with this proposition, do you see any way, even in the long term, to break this impasse? Dr. Vaishnav.
Thank you very much, Prem, and thanks for your question, and thanks to my panelists. I don't think that this can be chalked up to unique Indian culture or social customs. I think there's something much more systematic and quite frankly, very rational going on. And the analogy that I've used over the years to talk about this is to think about politics as a marketplace, as an electoral marketplace. And like any market, there are supply and demand factors that make the market. And if you apply that simple framework to thinking about this question, I think you can sort of demystify some of what's going on. So if you take the supply side, which is, why is it that criminals or people with criminal associations are being injected into the political bloodstream? you have to ask why parties are putting these candidates forward, right? And I think where that line of inquiry takes you very quickly is to the outsized role that money plays in Indian politics today. As the costs of elections have gone through the roof over the past several decades for numerous reasons, parties have not dedicated themselves to the hard work, the organizational hard work of building robust organizations, finding ways to keep their fiscal coffers in sync with the needs of those elections. And so they have been increasingly thrust into the embrace of what I call self-financing candidates. These are individual candidates with deep pockets who are self-financing in the following sense. They, of course, can cover the costs of their own campaign, but they're also willing to pay parties for the privilege of running under their party label. They're willing to subsidize less wealthy candidates who are allied with them in some way, and willing and able to engage also in the larger kinds of rent-seeking that many party and party elites engage in. So I think that money is really central, and the way in which political finance works and is regulated or is not regulated in India is central to understanding how these individuals get put forward on the ballot. But I think the even more interesting question is, and this really gets to the heart of your question, is what's going on with the voter, right? Because if we really do believe that these are largely free and fair elections, we have electronic voting machines. Most Indians, according to public opinion surveys, believe that the secret ballot is in fact secret. Why are voters choosing these candidates? And here I think the story is quite rich and quite layered. And the simple argument that I'd put forward to kind of boil it down is that in a context where social divisions like caste and religion, for instance, run rife, and where the rule of law is weak or weakly applied, that is, the government is not seen as a impartial or effective arbiter of the kinds of basic sovereign functions that states are supposed to perform. These two things interact and create an opening for criminal entrepreneurs who basically use their criminality as a sign of credibility to get things done for their constituents, right? To provide a modicum of safety, to provide a sense of social insurance, to intervene in the administration and delivery of benefits and services from the state, to adjudicate disputes, things that, again, the state should be doing on an even-handed basis, but for reasons we can't get into now, has not been, right? And so this is not a case of ignorant voters. It is not a case of illiterate voters necessarily. It is voters who are making a strategic calculation, not because they want to elect a criminal, but because they believe that this person might be able to better represent their interests in a very uncertain and difficult world when they don't believe that the state necessarily is looking after them. Now, what are the solutions? If this were just about information, one could think about rolling out massive civic education campaigns, about investing in media infrastructure. But this goes to two very important, deeper, much more complex policy domains. One is campaign finance reform. And on that, the need of the hour is to reduce the importance of money in politics, improve the degree of transparency. And frankly, India has been moving in the opposite direction. If you look at the developments over the past several years, they have essentially legitimized through legislation and law the opacity in the system through new instruments like electoral bonds, like creating a more permissive environment for foreign funding, eliminating the need for corporations to list on their annual profit and loss statements the kinds of transactions and contributions they're making. And so we all know what needs to be done, but unfortunately we're moving in the opposite direction. And just finally, I think the most important need of the day is really building governance from the ground up. There's really no shortcuts to that, because until and unless the citizen sees the state as having their best interests at heart, they will continue to rely on an intermediary who is able to sort of grease the wheels and work the system, right? So that means a whole suite of things, including plugging endemic vacancies that exist at every level of government. That means really taking seriously decentralization to what we call the third tier of government, that is government at the municipal and the village level, that is the closest to the people, and empowering them and holding them accountable. And I do think technology has a role to play, not as a substitute for state capacity, but as a way to augment state capacity. We have seen some studies that show that this has successfully, the use of technology in delivering transfers and benefits has cut out the middleman and reduced certain amount of corruption. It introduces new problems like infrastructural problems, people not able to access the technology. So it's not a panacea, but I do think it's moving the conversation in the right direction.
Thank you, Dr. Vaishnav. Actually, you've touched upon many points here, but one particularly leapt out at me where you talked about Indian political parties not having a robust internal system, actually being kind of, to some extent, petty tyrannies at the local level. It reminds me of a study that came out some months ago, which asked why Indians tend to emigrate out of the country even as it's going becoming more prosperous. And apparently, the finding was that although India is definitely a democracy and it grants its citizens a lot of freedoms, particularly at the federal level and at the political level, at the societal and cultural level, India is very conservative still. It still has elements of feudalism in it. And this means that sometimes, no matter how liberal the state itself might be or how enlightened it might be, the reality of people on the ground is that they're dealing with a very patriarchal society, and one where, be honest, any kind of competition, even electoral competition between candidates, is not really appreciated and is rigged in favor of the stronger party. We finally come to our last speaker, Dr. Vanda Felber-Brown, who can help us zoom out of the national picture and look at India from a global perspective. Dr. Felber-Brown, based on your studies of organized crime in India and your very deep understanding of the country and its cultural rifts, its divisions, and its complexity, what in your assessments are the key obstructors of a policy response? Is it that elite corruption prevents an honest debate on criminal risks? Or is it that community sympathies for gangsters blocks government action? Do you observe deficiencies in state capacity at the local level, which have prevented the police from being able to control mafia-style criminality? You have studied organized crime in a range of contexts, including Latin America and Africa. How would you compare India's operational realities with these other contexts? Dr. Felber-Brown.
Well, thank you. Let me start with doing the comparative study before, or doing the comparative quick review before I come to the questions of policy responses or their lack of. So how does India compare to Colombia, to Mexico, to Italy, for example? What are the various illegal economies in India and organized crime groups? India is one of the world's leading countries in human trafficking and smuggling. A lot of its centers in India itself does not cross the border, but there are also significant flows of human smuggling and trafficking across the border between Nepal and India in other surrounding countries. India is a very significant actor in wildlife poaching and trafficking. This goes not just to tigers and other big cats, which generates often most media coverage, but applies to wide classes of animals, be they reptiles, tortoises, turtles and tortoises, but also birds, rhinos, elephants. Illegal logging is also very widespread and heavily organized with strong penetrations of both mafia and industry. This is illegal logging in the country, whether it's for sourcing hardwoods like rosewood for traffic to China and elsewhere, for domestic market, and deforestation to generate land. There are very significant cross-border flows between Myanmar and Nepal and India. But at the same time, Indian logging company are some of the dirtiest companies, Indian logging companies operating abroad are some of the dirtiest companies engaged in a wide set of corruption and illegal logging practices in places like Indonesia, for example. There is tremendous amount of illegal fishing around the subcontinent. and sometimes this gives rise to conflict with fishermen in countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. But the illegal fishing is not simply artisanal around the surrounding waters. India's large fishing fleets are perhaps not as notorious as Japanese, Chinese, or European Union fishing fleets, but nonetheless, they engage in very devastating, very extensive illegal logging. India is deeply implicated in gold smuggling. We heard from Natalia about the role in diamond smuggling. Gold smuggling is another example. And again, this is a combination of both criminalized actors that we think about as mafias, but also large industry leaders. For example, one example to point out today is the vast gold smuggling by the Wagner Group that heads into Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, and where Indian traders, big Indian gold companies, as well as individual traders and organized crime groups, play very significant role in laundering of that gold. Drugs smuggling is another example, and I would say it's one of the largest illegal economies in India and deeply unappreciated in the scope and role that India plays, not simply in poppy cultivation and heroin production, lots of which supplies the internal market, but really in the fentanyl and synthetic drugs market aspect, with India a significant supplier of precursors as well as finished synthetic drugs, such as to the United States, but to other parts of the world. And of course, Indian pharmaceutical companies and the industry overall are deeply implicated, and really the principal sources of smuggling of tramadol, industrial potency tramadol, to Africa and the epidemic in Africa. We could speak about contraband smuggling, piracy, land theft, and squatting. We could speak about toxic waste, sand theft, heavily criminalized begging that is often controlled by organized crime groups in Africa. We often force this in India, rather, we often force disfigurement, a very strong element of that criminalized economy. Obviously, forced labor, crypto fraud, cyber fraud more general. I want to just highlight water theft and smuggling, where along with Pakistan, India has really the most advanced criminalized economy around water, with so-called water mafia, as they are referred to in India, playing outsized role in illegal sourcing, illegal distribution, corrupt practices, co-optation of water boards, and of course, contributing to a vast set of deeply problematic water sustainability outcomes. So this review, does this sound to you like Nigeria, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia? Well, it should. Certainly the scope of these illegal economies, as well as the use of the links between politics and crime, are very emblematic of these countries. And of course, if one looks across these countries, the levels of violence vary greatly. Italian mafia groups are as involved in politics, dominate, extortion, are often deeply implicated in many legal economies, not just illegal economies, but are by and large non-violent. This, of course, contrasts with criminal groups in Mexico, whose levels of violence is on par of civil war. So India is more in the category of less violent crime. It's not organized crime that is as peaceful as the Chinese triads, for example, but less violent crime. But in the scope of activities and the numbers of actors, it very much resembles these countries. Now, there is nonetheless a high variance in the degrees of organization complexity and the presence of polycrime groups in India. And in fact, we don't have very many polycrime organized groups in India. What does it mean, polycrime groups? This would be something like the Sinaloa cartel that is involved in drug trafficking, extortion, illegal logging, the capture of legal fishing industries, the capture of legal logging that operates also from Mexico all the way to Australia Pacific, with a growing presence in Africa and Asia, and very thick and often dominant presence in criminal markets all the way down to Colombia, Ecuador, and beyond. We don't have many Indian groups. In fact, we have no organized crime Indian groups that has as great international reach and that often have significant international reach. Often the greatest international reach in illegal economies originating in India involves legal actors, such as the pharmaceutical industry that behaves illegally, or the gold and diamond industry. A lot of criminal groups in India are highly localized. They might be centered on Mumbai that we have heard about. They might be centered on other regions. So they're often not polycrime. There is still a great degree of specialization, and their transnational presence is limited. But it doesn't mean that the illegal economies in which they participate is localized. It can be transnational. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Felber-Brown. Your understanding of India and its illicit markets are actually phenomenal. It's inspirational. I would say it also puts to shame Indian scholars such as myself that we have not been able to do this kind of path-breaking research that you have embarked on. So thank you very much for sharing these insights, ma'am. We have now slightly under 20 minutes for Q&A. So I would invite the panelists in reverse order of which they spoke to please pose a question to each other if they have any. Dr. Felber-Brown, would you like to go first, ma'am?
Well, thank you, Prem, and you have been way too kind in characterizing my response. And I do realize that I omitted speaking about policy responses, which I hope we will have a chance to come to. But let me ask a question to you. You have been way too modest. You yourself have done very significant and very robust and highly impressive research into both the crime terrorism nexus in India, which goes way beyond the D Company and Dawood Ibrahim, and takes place in the borderlands with Myanmar, takes place in the Punjab area, as we heard. And you have done a lot of work on various organized crime and illegal economies in India yourself. Please give us your take on some of the questions you're asking us. What are some of the key findings from your study, and why do you believe there is not enough attention being paid both by Indian scholars and by international scholars?
Thank you, Dr. Felber-Brown. I really appreciate the compliments. I will answer your question in due course. I'd like to quickly move to Dr. Milan Vaishnav. Sir, do you have a question for the other panelists or the group as a whole?
Just a quick question for Ajay Sani. I thought your presentation was very interesting, and for people who are looking at India from the outside, and maybe for people inside too, Dawood Ibrahim has this larger than life kind of mythology around him. Whenever there's some kind of development in the organized crime world, somebody somewhere links it back to Dawood Ibrahim and D Company. But my question is, as we sit and talk here today in the year 2022, how would you characterize what his role actually is in the organized crime scene? Are we too trigger happy to sort of put everything at his doorstep, or is there a good justifiable reason to keep coming back to this kind of singular figure?
Thank you, Dr. Vaishnav. Very quickly, I would like to move on to our next speaker, Professor Galisheva. Would you have a question, ma'am, for the group or for any other speaker?
Okay, thank you very much. All speakers are very interesting. My question is to Dr. Ajay Sani. Your presentation is rather interesting. And tell me, please, are there any connections with Maharashtra organized crime groups with other Indian states? And with South Asian countries? Are there any representatives of Maharashtra organized crime groups in South Asian countries?
Thank you, Professor Galisheva. Mr. Unithan, sir, do you have a question for the group or for any other speaker?
Well, Prem, I have a question for Dr. Sani. Talking about the how organized crime groups have kind of transitioned on to international terrorism, and the classic case of that being Dawood Ibrahim. But there are also such instances in Punjab. Now, this is an area that Dr. Sani has studied extensively, where you have cross-border smugglers being used extensively, and the old smuggling networks, exactly the way they were used to land explosives in Mumbai in 1993. The smuggling networks between Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab being used by intelligence agencies. And how do you see this actually playing out? Has it happened anywhere else in the world that organized crime networks have kind of, segued into terrorist groups and, being used by intelligence agencies to kind of wage covert war?
Thank you, Mr. Unithan. Dr. Sani, it seems that you have drawn most of the comments and actually questions on this session. But sir, do you have a question for any of the other panelists or the group?
Yeah, Sandeep, I would like to ask you, because you sort of did talk about the corporatization of crime or organized crime in Mumbai in particular. I'd like to sort of suggest that you say that they've gone underground. In what pattern have they, or fashion have they gone underground? In some sense, I think Dr. Felber Brown had made a very important set of observations that you see actually so much of this crime ongoing. Have they gone underground in the sense of doing less? Or have they gone underground in the sense of doing far more legal activity illegally, if you understand? For instance, mining is a legal activity, but they do illegal mining. Building is a legal activity, but a large quantum of violations are sort of engaged in, and these are facilitated with or engaged in by the organized crime groupings. So how do you see the texture of crime changing? Is it simply that they've just become less violent, gone deeper underground or something like that, diminished their activities? There is some sense, I think there was also a suggestion by Dr. Galischeva that the overall quantum of the gray economy had sort of diminished. So that might also be part of the dynamic. But I'd like to ask you, how do you see the transformation of the texture of crime, particularly in Mumbai? Because the others, there is a whole range of other activities which are different from each one state to the other.
Thank you, Dr. Sani. We have roughly 10 minutes for the answers. Mr. Unithan, would you like to go first, sir? Since most of the questions are directed to Dr. Sani, perhaps you could go first.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sani. Well, the question is yes. A lot of the Mumbai crime has actually become white collar. They don't feel the need to shoot people in the streets as they once did 20 years back. As you know, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, for almost a decade, there were these very violent shootouts. There were gang wars. There were targeted killings of businessmen and film personalities who didn't pay up the extortion money. And that was the very, it was a growth phase of the underworld, if you can call it. And the underworld in Mumbai has kind of followed the pattern as is the case with all other transnational criminal groups across the world, organized syndicates, whether it's the mafia or the triads or the Japanese crime syndicates, where they've actually gone white collar. They do a lot more of their business. Businesses are legit. As you know, real estate is a very large source of income in Mumbai for the underworld, and that continues to be the case. So a lot of their earnings now are from these kind of legit businesses. They are, of course, involved in gold smuggling and as they did once in the past, drug smuggling, gold smuggling, all of that still continues, but a lot of the legit businesses have now kind of taken over. So that's the reason that they are not in your face anymore, and they're just a little below the radar, but they're all there. They're all well entrenched, and they're still going about their businesses. The Chota Rajan gang is still there. They're still extorting money from builders. They are making their investments. Dawood Ibrahim's gang and his consigliere Chota Shakil, they're all very active and conducting business as usual. And you have this very unique phenomenon in Mumbai of the offshore dons, which is thanks to the advances of telecommunication and mobile phones and satellite phones. You have dons sitting overseas, whether it's in Karachi or in Dubai or Bangkok, controlling their trade from remote locations. But that still continues in Mumbai. The underworld is still around. Like I said, it's just below the radar. A lot of it is legit and white collar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Unitha. And Dr. Sani, would you like to answer some of the questions posed to you, sir?
Yeah, Dr. Vaishnav said, is Dawood Ibrahim still as central to the entire organized crime scenario in India as he was earlier? He's important because he is essentially a facilitator more of terrorist activities than of anything else. And he has become an instrumentality of the Pakistani state, facilitating such activities. But I think it's very important, Dr. Felber Brown gave you a whole range of organized criminal activities that are ongoing in India even today. And Dawood Ibrahim does not play a very significant role in most of these. In fact, they are highly dispersed. They are more and more localized, depending upon what opportunities are provided along which particular part of the country. Border areas are different. Sea ports are different. So you have a very, very wide range of activities ongoing. And Dawood Ibrahim, though he still is important as a link for certain of the most extreme kinds of activities, is not really commanding the any very large proportion of the total quantum of organized criminal activities and revenues. Dr. Galisheva, you see, as far as the organized crime groups in Maharashtra are concerned, yes, they have linkages. In fact, Sandeep just mentioned, several of them are now based outside the country. Others have linkages across borders, certainly into Dawood Ibrahim is still a facilitator and substantial controller of the organized crime activities in Mumbai. And hence, those who are operating within Mumbai are still very, very strongly connected with the Dawood network, not only in Mumbai, but in West Asia, in the Emirates, wherever that Dawood Ibrahim network is there. One of the points I think that has not been, I think, glossed over simply in the brevity of presentations is, finance. Hawala is one of the most significant activities and a facilitator of a whole range of other crimes, a whole range of the gray or black economy functioning, of terrorism and the finance of terrorism. And Hawala is an enormously important element. And Dawood is still a very, here I come back to the earlier question, that Dawood is still a very significant player, or rather Dawood-linked elements. Dawood himself doesn't do so much himself, but there are lieutenants who are handling enormous networks of Hawala or illegal financial transactions globally. As far as Sandeep, your question about crime groups transitioning to terrorism, or the other way around, terrorist organizations becoming crime groups, I see more of a trend the other way around. You know, when degraded terrorist formations tend to take up organized criminal activities more and more. Because the political objectives and the ideology and whatever they may have been propagating earlier becomes less important to survival. And for survival, finance becomes very important. And then they slowly get sucked into doing nothing but criminal activity. I do not see any, to my limited, I study South Asia, and to my limited knowledge of the subject, I have not seen a comparable transition of an organized crime group to a terrorist formation that we saw in the D Company and Dawood Ibrahim. Principally, I think because by and large, organized criminal groups are essentially profit-driven. They are not, even the Dawood gang, before the 1993 incidents, was a fairly secular group. You will be aware of this more than I am. That they had, in fact, many of these groupings that now exist, which are opposed to Dawood, were Hindu operatives within the Dawood gang. So it's only because of the nature of communal polarization, the 1993 events, the riots in Mumbai, that he actually makes that transition from a financially motivated or profit motivated organized criminal group to an ideologically driven actor who engages in terrorism. I don't think this is a natural transition. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sani. We have some audience questions actually. asking us first whether we could suggest measures to improve the discussions in India on the topic of organized crime, and also pointing out that the government and the bureaucracy is not really open to the idea of primary research. From my limited experience, and this perhaps goes to what Dr. Felber-Brown said, I think one of the reasons we haven't got much research on transnational organized crime in India is because we're talking about essentially two phenomena here. First, there's organized crime, which happens at the very local level. It consists of various scams, political groups, mafias, and so on. And then there's the transnational component. And as Dr. Sani has rather fantastically articulated, they're not exactly similar. They don't overlap very strongly. Dawood Ibrahim is not that important when it comes to India's domestic scene. He's very important as a terrorist and as a covert asset of Pakistan, but he's not actually significant when you look at the enormity, illicit economies of India. I would suggest that the problem is that first, no country really likes to have its own bots examined too closely, least of all by its own scholars and journalists. And there is a tendency to sweep unpleasant insights and information under the carpet. And without naming countries, we all know that even in the developed world, if you point fingers at a certain state and you say, look, this state has been found to be racist by a UN report, that state's ambassador will promptly deny it in the UN Council on Human Rights. I'm thinking of specifically which certain country. You can probably Google it and figure out which one I'm referring to. So that's one issue, that we can't examine embarrassing stories. Another side is that transnational organized crime really does have a secret and national security component. The British scholar Mark Galeotti, writing in 2018, warned of a so-called spook gangster nexus. And I would actually think that's worth looking at. The nexus between intelligence agencies and organized crime has been under-examined. But that plays a crucial role because organized crime transnational organized crime can serve to undermine states, can serve to help carry out paramilitary actions. Galeotti has warned about this. And India faces this problem. It has faced it in Punjab, it has faced it in Kashmir, in Mumbai. India does not have a unitary state like China does. There is no equivalent of the Chinese Communist Party, which can serve as a super mafia and which can control organized crime groups and instrumentalize them to serve the national interest. So as Dr. Felber-Brown very correctly pointed, Indian organized crime is very localized. And that means actually that we lack the meta structure. We lack a national level narrative and picture.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. This talk was just one of 85 from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. To get access to the rest, head over to oc24.heysummit.com. Thanks for listening.